So today we're going to talk about the disabled access credit. In the United States, the deadline for tax season is around the corner, and there are tax credits available to businesses who spend time with making their websites accessible. So if your business has spent money on services related to web accessibility, you may be eligible to get a credit on your tax returns from 2024. And so today we're going to take a deeper dive into the details of the disabled access credit. And just to recap, the reason we want to make our websites accessible or workable so that people with disabilities can access the content on them, we should look at the current statistics with regards to disability in the United States and globally. It's estimated by the CDC that 28% of the US population has a disability, while the rate is 16% of the global population. And so this is a very wide market segment that crosses all types of minority groups. So it's important to consider the disabled when designing your websites. Why accessibility matters. So in this day and age, where more and more we are going to the web to access information, it is critically important for people with disabilities to access that same information. So we're helping a group that has been largely marginalized from accessing content on the web and giving them the tools so that they can have the same access to information that everybody else without disabilities can access. And this is critical. And for a business, it affects your reach to new customers as well as helping to retain customers. And it also reflects on your brand and how you're presenting yourself to a market if you're someone that is helping everyone access what you're providing on the web. And what are some of the benefits of making your website accessible? First of all, you're complying with regulations. So as a business, you won't get in trouble with the law. There are laws not only in the United States, but in many countries abroad as well that require that you have an accessible website. And if you are not someone currently making sure your website is accessible to those with disabilities, by doing so, you will reach a new audience. And your search engine optimization, SEO, will naturally improve by taking steps to make your website accessible to those with disabilities. And in general, we've found that making the experience a good experience for people with disabilities actually improves user experience for everybody. So a lot of the things that are done or created or developed for the purpose of helping with people with disabilities access web content actually are tools that everybody uses to help with their experience. So by doing this, you're making your usability of your website better for everybody, and that can increase your reach. It can increase your sales. It's helpful overall. So in the United States, we have the Disabled Access Credit, and it's a tax credit that can offset the cost of web accessibility by up to $5,000 per year. It was added as a government incentive to help businesses offset the cost of accessibility improvements because the United States wants to improve the level of web accessibility of websites. And by offering this incentive, it helps business offset the cost because it is an increased cost, whether it's time spent taking that extra step to make your website accessible or having to hire someone because you don't personally have the skills. You're going to spend money hiring a consultant or using a software or using a tool to help the experience for people with disabilities. And there is a financial cost to that, and that means it can be a deterrent for a lot of businesses that are small businesses that don't have this budget. So the credit is available to businesses to help them. It's considered a non-refundable tax credit, and it's up to 50% of the eligible accessibility expenses, and it is capped at $5,000. And they don't include the first $250 spent on accessibility. So this means that a total of $10,250 of accessibility expenditures are eligible for this credit year over year. So that means if you continue to have expenses every year for accessibility, every year you can take this tax credit. So every taxable year you can take this credit. And so how do we get these numbers? Just explain. So if you were to have a total, for example, of $10,250 total eligible expenses, so expenses that you have had for improving accessibility. You would subtract the first $250 because that's not covered by this credit. That leaves you with $10,000, and then you have the 50% credit, and that means that 50% of a 10,000 would be 5,000, and that is a non-refundable tax credit. And what are the differences between a non-refundable and a refundable credit? So non-refundable means that if the credit exceeds your tax liability, then you cannot get that excess money as a refund of money. For example, if your overall tax liability is $2,000 and you have a non-refundable credit of $5,000 as a result of the disabled access credit, you can offset that tax liability of $2,000. That means you would pay zero taxes because your total tax liability is $2,000. You have this non-refundable credit of $5,000, so that offsets that $2,000 zero. The remaining $3,000 of that credit, because you only used $2,000 of the $5,000, is carried over to the next year, but you don't get that money back as a refund. That's what non-refundable means. If you instead had a refundable credit, then you would offset the $2,000 in tax liability, but the IRS would also give you the $3,000, the difference, because you had a total of $5,000 of credit. Just to be clear, the disabled access credit is a non-refundable tax credit. So if your credit is more than your actual tax liability, you will just get the tax liability offset, but you're not going to get an additional refund in addition to it. So who qualifies for this credit? So in order to qualify for this credit, you only need to meet one of two criteria. One is that you have 30 or fewer full-time equivalent employees. So again, more of a smaller business. And number two, your total revenue is less than $1 million in the previous tax year. So again, this credit is meant to help small and medium-sized businesses. So if you're a large corporation and you're spending a lot of money on accessibility because you have a huge website with 1,000 pages or whatever, unfortunately, if you've made more than $1 million in the previous tax year, or you have more than 30 full-time equivalent employees, then you would not be eligible for this tax credit. It's generally because small and medium businesses need help to have the budget to help fix their websites for web accessibility. They've put this credit as an incentive for small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. And I've been talking about web accessibility, but the reality is the Disabled Access Credit is actually for all ADA, or American with Disabilities Act, related expenditures. So web accessibility is included, so any sort of web accessibility solutions or tools for web optimization. So it does include things like overlays and things like that. But it also includes the production of accessible formats. So if you have created multiple formats of what you're producing, so that there's a format in Braille, there's a format that's large print, there's audio tape, an audio version of whatever you're doing. And it includes fees for consulting services. So if you're hiring a firm to consult on what you need to do for improving accessibility in your business, that fee would be considered an ADA-related expenditure. If you hire sign language interpreters, that's considered an ADA-related expenditure. So for instance, if you're running a conference and you want to make sure that sign language interpretation is provided to the people attending the conference, the hiring of that sign language interpreter would be covered, whatever you spend on them. Purchase of adaptive equipment. So if in order to do things in the office, maybe you have a worker that requires adaptive equipment to do their job, if you as the owner pays for that adaptive equipment, the expenditure on that would be considered an ADA-related expenditure. And any sort of physical barriers that you have made changes in your office to fix, that in your facility or in your vehicles is an ADA-related expenditure. So if you actually have a physical, you're not just online only, but you have a physical business, and for example, you've installed ramps to get in your building, that would be an ADA-related expenditure. Or if your vehicles have special modifications that allow a person with disabilities to drive the vehicle, that would be considered an ADA-related expenditure. So it's a wide range of things that are covered under the Disabled Access Credit. So here's an example. So let's say a business hires a consulting company that provides website accessibility remediation services. And they get quoted that it'll cost them $3,250 to make their website accessible from the state of the website currently, to fix all the issues on their website. Let's say it's a bigger website. The first $250 would not be covered by the credit. So we subtract $250 from $3,250. That leaves you with $3,000 in eligible expenses. The credit is 50% of the eligible expenses. 50% of $3,000 would be $1,500. So $1,500 is the credit that you could take on the purchase of the particular service. Now, they could be also other services that the business is involved with that has to do with accessibility, so they can add those on as well. But in the case of this particular job with this particular cost, the credit would be $1,500. And there is no double dipping on the credit. So this situation happens if, let's say, many accessibility overlay companies will offer affiliate commissions to people that are promoting the overlay to other people. So often people involved with web development or design will be incentivized to sell a particular platform or overlay to a business to help them with their web accessibility, and that person gets an affiliate commission for every sale of that software or overlay to another company. So, for instance, if that person that's affiliating has a certain amount of expenditure so that they have access to that software overlay, and then they resell it to some other organization or company for use on the company's website, the person that receives the overlay, the customer, cannot take the credit in addition to the person that's selling the overlay, the affiliate person. It cannot be claimed by both of you. It can be claimed only by one or the other. So if you are doing, let's say you're providing the accessibility services to your customer and they don't reimburse you for that expense, so you're paying a certain amount of money to get access to that overlay to be able to provide it to your customers, but the customer isn't directly reimbursing you for that, then you can claim the credit. But if you claim the credit, they can't. Or, for instance, the customer claims the credit because they bought the service from you and they spent a certain amount of money. If they're claiming the credit as your customer, and that's some sort of incentive that you tell them, like a lot of times they'll say your expenses, you might educate them about the same disabled access credit, and so they know that the money they spend with you to get this access to the software, they can claim the credit, so they know that. So if they claim the credit, then you can't claim the credit. It can't be reported by both of you. So if you're in the situation where you're spending on something but somebody else is using it and you aren't being reimbursed completely for your costs, you can't both take the credit. One of you has to do it. So you do have to keep good records as to which customers claiming the credit and which ones are not, so that you don't double dip. So how do you actually claim the credit? What's the way that you actually claim this credit on your tax form? So is form 8826, and this is the link to that form, and I'll make sure that this is available. And there's no need for pre-approval. There's no burden of proof, so you don't need to submit the form with various receipts or anything to claim the credit. However, you do need to keep your records, because if you are audited in the future, you better be able to prove that this credit was claimed appropriately. So even though there's no burden of proof in the meaning that you don't need to submit things ahead of time to claim the credit, that doesn't mean you don't need to keep records. You still need to keep your records, because if you ever get audited, then they're going to look at this credit that you claimed and make sure that it was appropriate that you claimed the credit. And if you didn't claim it appropriately, then you will be responsible for paying back the IRS plus any sort of back taxes plus any sort of penalties they give you for inappropriately claiming something that you should not have. So even though you don't have to have a burden of proof when you're claiming the credit, doesn't mean that you don't need to keep the records. So make sure you have records of everything that you're doing that substantiates claiming this credit. And just to show you the form, it's a very simple tax form. You would put the total eligible accessibility expenditures that we talked about on the first line, the minimum amount is 250. You would subtract that out, and then the maximum amount is the 10,000. Where the 10,000 plus the 250 is that total 10,250 we spoke about earlier in the talk. And then you compare your amount with the 10,000 and you put the smaller amount in line 5. So for instance, if you're like claiming, if your total expenditures were 5,250, you subtract 2 from line 1, you'll get 5,000. 5,000 is smaller than 10,000. You would put 5,000 in line 5. You would multiply line 5 by 50%. That leaves you with $2,500. And that would be, if you have a partnership or S corporation, there's some additional things you need to fill out for 7. You would add lines 6 and 7, and you have to make sure that amount is not more than 5,000. So in the case of our math, we would be at $2,500. So that would be the credit that we could claim. So I mentioned that you should be keeping detailed records, even though there's no burden of proof. So make sure you have the appropriate documentation. So what is the documentation you need to be keeping? You need to keep the amount of the expenditure. So what was the cost? You need to have it written down what the expenditure was for. And you should also have information as to why it's eligible for this credit. So make sure you have these things as documentation when you're claiming this credit. And what are the deadlines? So the deadline for the S corporations and partnerships has actually passed. It was March 17th, but you could have extended, or if you've already filed and you realize you should have taken advantage of this, you could always send in an amendment to your taxes. For most people, you'll be dealing with your personal tax return, and the deadline in the United States for personal tax returns is April 15th. So hopefully this is enough time for you to gather information for your tax accountant so that if you qualify for this credit, you can apply for it for this coming tax year. So summary, the maximum credit for the disabled tax credit is going to be $5,000 per year. It can be claimed year over year for eligible expenditures, which means like every year you can take this credit if you continue to have ongoing expenses with regards to accessibility, which is probable because, as we've talked about many times, accessibility is a journey. It's not a do it once and you're done, because laws change, because software change, technology changes. Often fixing your website is an ongoing thing. It should be audited every year. So if you're auditing, that's an expenditure. If you're paying somebody else to audit and you're spending money on that. So every year you may have expenses on accessibility, and this credit is something that you can do year over year. And it is only available to U.S. businesses. This is for the United States tax code. And you must meet this criteria of under 1 million in revenue, or not both, just one or the other, or fewer than 30 employees, and that's full-time equivalent employees. And it's important to consult with a tax professional to fully understand this credit and the eligible expenses and how it relates to your personal and business tax situation. Disclaimer, I am not an accountant. This is information I'm giving to you based on my understanding of what is out there, but I am not an accountant. I am not a tax professional. So anything I say, you should definitely double check with your tax professional, your accountant, to make sure whatever you're doing is actually eligible for the credit and you understand this credit. Bring it up with them and have a discussion. But remember that I am not an accountant. I'm bringing you information that I found attending conferences and looking up things on the web by myself, but I am not an accountant. So that's my disclaimer. Before you take this as tax advice, you should definitely speak to an accountant or speak to a tax professional. And because everybody's tax situation is different, and yours may be different in a certain way that makes you not eligible for the credit, and I want to make sure that you speak to someone who has the expertise to give you the right advice. And that's basically it for the disabled access credit. I hope it's helpful to people to understand. I think I get a lot of questions from other designers or people in web development. They're trying to educate their customers about web accessibility and the importance of web accessibility. And cost is often a barrier for a lot of people, for especially a small business where they have a limited budget, they have limited funds. And this can be a way to help offset those costs for them if they're eligible for this credit. So if that's one of the issues, finances, you should probably get them on the phone with their accountant to talk about this credit to see if it's something that can help defray the costs of you working for them or doing the extra steps and extra things to make their website compliant as well as just more usable for people with disabilities and everybody in general. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope this helps people with their taxes for this year.